Good evening and welcome to For the People. When you get a chance to talk with a scholar whose whole life has been steeped in the history of black people around the globe, you don't let that opportunity pass. Dr. John Henrik Clarke not only knows our history, but has lived it. He is one of the true wise men of our time. Dr. Clarke was born in Columbus, Georgia, and is Professor Emeritus of African History and former chairman of the Afrikan and Puerto Rican Studies Department at Hunter College in New York City. In this three-part series with Dr. Clarke, we cover a variety of topics. We begin by putting this series of questions to the scholar. Dr. Clarke, black people looking out at the world today may have some questions about black people's, about where black people's interests lie, about who our friends are, about loyalty to black people, and questions regarding the battle between the United States and Russia. Let's take, first of all, questions we have about where our interests lie.
We have not been very good at making coalitions through history. And we have not been very good at understanding the nature of our interests, because we have been under the domination of different forces. And when these different forces are at odds with each other, we choose to take sides, assuming that our interests must be on one or the other side, not knowing that sometimes our interests may not be on either side, although physically we might be on both sides or one of the other side, and we have to deal with the reality of being on physically one or the other side without knowing that there is no great concern for us and our welfare on either side. Now, in the great battle of the superpowers between Russia and the United States, there's no great concern for us. But in the United States, there must be concern for our presence, because there's so many of us in the United States. So Russia is concerned about what we will do, because 30 million people and what they will do would concern both of them. But the loyalty and the commitment of either one to us is not a great concern to either one of them. Our first concern is politically to ourselves, what we will do for ourselves and what we will commit ourselves to do for ourselves, and to what extent will we make coalitions with other African people throughout the world, and understand that our greatest strength is to what we will do in relationship to other African people throughout the world, to bring pressure on both of the powers to make a better commitment to us.
As an African American looking out at the world, and a historian, who do you see as being our friend today?
Potentially, I see a possibility of some of the people in the third world being our friend, but I do not depend on that very much. I think the people of the so-called third world will vacillate and turn to one of those two superpowers, depending on which one makes them the better deal, even if they have to do it at our expense. I see our greatest potential friend being ourselves, once we get ourselves together and realize that throughout the world we might number close to 1 billion people. And with that many people, we may not need outside friends as much as we think we do.
What did you say about the mirror?
My analogy in that case is that maybe if we're looking for friends, we should find a mirror. and don't move from that mirror until we find a friend, because the person that's staring back at us might be the best friend we're ever going to have. And once we make a friend out of ourselves, maybe we will be politically and culturally and commercially on our way.
Some time ago, Japanese Prime Minister Nakasone made a disparaging remark about black intelligence. If you could give him a brief lesson on black intelligence, what would you tell him?
I would tell him that if he read briefly the history of black America 50 years after slavery, some black inventors had laid before this country some of the basic inventions that helped to industrialize the United States, some basic inventions that are now being used in Japan. And case in point, lubrication by McCoy, the electrical system, Granville Wood, the firmament that went into the making of the electric light, Lewis Latimer. I could go on indefinitely, just naming inventions by blacks in the 50-year period after slavery. No people have made comparable progress in 50 years after slavery as the American black. Built institutions, universities, in that short space of time, restructured their family life. Remember, during slavery, it was against the law to have a family. And we had to build the most delicate institution in the life of any people is the family. We had to build that, find some fragments of our family. Many members of our family had been sold. We had to go state after state searching for them, didn't find some, put them back together again. And yet we had church institutions by the end of the century, large institutions. We built the Black Masons. Tuskegee was on its way. Fisk was on its way. The land-grant colleges on its way. All of this within a 50 years radius after slavery, plus the fact that blacks had invented some of the basic skills, some of the basic inventions that helped to industrialize America. Show me any people in the world that made a comparable amount of progress after slavery.
You mentioned...
That's indicative of our intelligence.
You mentioned something earlier about blacks in the Japanese world earlier, a little while ago.
So there was some research that tend to indicate that in the early ancient world, the Japanese lived along the coast of Korea, and that they had a lowly lot, and that early African sailors in Asia took them to the island of Nippon. And at this time in their history, they did not have the right to have surnames, and that their early surnames came from the African sea captains that took them to the island. And this accounts for the fact that so many Japanese names resemble African names.
I realize that to a certain extent, you don't even want to deal with Nakasone's comments, but I'm asking these questions of you for those, especially black people in the audience, who might not have the perception that would allow them to look at his statement in the way that might be appropriate. You also, in your presentation earlier, talked about Mahatma Gandhi's attitude toward Africans, and I'm asking this because many of us look at other people of color as necessarily being our friends. Would you comment on...
That was an assumption. The assumption is because Mahatma Gandhi adopted a nonviolent approach to social change. And the assumption, because he was in South Africa, and Martin Luther King adopted a similar approach, that Mahatma Gandhi was a friend of blacks. Not necessarily. Mahatma Gandhi was an East Indian nationalist. That and nothing more. Mahatma Gandhi did not have much to say, if anything, in favor of the Chinese and other oppressed people in Asia. He devoted all of his time to India and to India alone. While he lived in South Africa, he did not do very much, if anything, for the condition of the blacks in South Africa. If you read the incident of Mahatma Gandhi on the train, the true incident, not the movie incident, the true incident, he resented being put in the car with the Africans. He was a brown Englishman with a Cambridge education in law. He was no great lover of Africans. And all the time, people were making Mahatma Gandhi a universal humanitarian. He was never a universal humanitarian. He never pretended to be a universal humanitarian. And it is unfortunate, but Martin Luther King and the people around Martin Luther King never understood Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi was a brilliant politician doing a job for his people. He was an Indian nationalist, and he was good at it.
And you would say that there's nothing wrong with that.
And there's nothing wrong with that. Like most politicians, he was a pretty good actor. And like most politicians, he was partly a con man. And like most politicians, he was partly a faker. Some of his fasts were fakes.
Now, what do you mean there?
I mean, he said that I will not take any drink any hard food. He just sip a little goat's milk and, and fast into death. If you know goat and know goat's milk, you can sip goat's milk and live indefinitely. You never did. But he did start an economic system for his people.
Okay.
I mean, had Martin Luther King did the same thing, he could have literally revolutionized the economy of black America. Gandhi took off all his Western clothes and sent the Indian people back to basics, to the spinning wheel. And when the British charged too much for salt, he started his famous salt march to the sea. Back to basics. These are elements of Gandhiism
that King never picked up on.
Never picked up on, never saw. And King could have done miracles with that aspect of Gandhiism. Suppose King had have told black Americans, personally, I'll never wear any clothes that you don't make. He could have revolutionized our economy. He could have started black Americans employing each other, making each other's clothes. We'd stop begging for jobs and create our own job. He could have started us on the road to an independent economy within the United States. We are a nation within a nation searching for a nationality. We could have found our nationality and our identity within the United States to the extent we could have set up a separate economy. And he's the only kind of voice strong enough to have made us do it. And he missed his mark. I don't say I don't love him. He did us some valuable things. But had he truly understood Gandhiism. Gandhi created a fabric industry for his people by telling them, make the clothes you wear. India has one of the largest fabric industries in the world today, right now. Indians make their shoes now. He left them with a basic industry.
You say we keep repeating our history because we've never learned the lessons. What are some of the main lessons we've never learned?
Is that down through history, most people who pretend that they are our friends ultimately betray us. The first invaders of Africa, the Hyksos, 1680 BC, came in 100 years before the invasion and ultimately betrayed us. And that most of the people we have befriended in our history have never paid us back for befriending them and were never available when we needed them.
Why do you think we have this, as Chancellor William calls it, this drive for friendship, for brotherhood? What?
It's good and bad. We came from a kind of climate and an atmosphere where we could afford generosity. We did not come from a climate of scarcity. When you come from a climate and an atmosphere where you can pick your breakfast out of a bush or fish it out of the water, you don't have to fight your brother for your breakfast or compete. You have a different kind of temperament.
And that is Africa.
Yeah. See, pay attention to these three things. When they are plentiful, it makes a difference. In a society where you have an adequate supply of land, water, and women, there's less pressure in the society. In a society where you have a scarcity of land, water, and women, there's conflict and tension. And you can't miss either one. You can't underestimate the absence of either one. Europe in that cold, there was always a scarcity of one of those items. There was always a conflict around one of those items. So the man got real strong and saw one of those items, he would take it. And that would create conflict among the people who had it taken from, who had the item taken from them. So one man would have more land than he needed, then he would imprison other people to till his land just to live. So now you got feudalism. But Africa had enough land. So nobody had to take anybody's land because there was enough land, water, and women. That sounds insignificant, but you break it down, it makes for a different temperament. In African society, you had a land tenju approach. The land could neither be bought or sold because it is the collective property of the whole society. So the chief or the king or the ruler made sure that each person got enough land to till, to feed his family. And no one man took more land than he needed to support his family. No feudalism, no fight, no conflict. So we got that, you get that settled. Once you get settled, the concept of enough land to feed your family, and what you gonna fight over? You got your woman, you got your land, you got your water. You got those things that sustain life. You got security built in your society that protects you with those societies. The European didn't have those things. So he's got conflict. And the ice had just melted from the glacier age. And he just came out of the cave. That's the only place he could find warmth. And he's been living so close together in order to keep warm. He's not, see, sister, brother, mother, he hasn't established kinship systems like the African.
What do you mean?
Well, you living so close together, you might end up cohabiting with sister, brother, or mother. You haven't established taboos, what not to do, as clearly as the African. The first people to establish.
You mentioned a disease among the Europeans. What was that?
There was the bleeders disease among the European royalty, because they married so close together, the bloodlines got thin. And the blood wouldn't coagulate in order to keep from a slight cut would cause excessive bleeding.
Okay.
Principally because like you marry your cousin, then you marry your sister, you know, there's not enough mixture of new blood to cause enough health in your blood for it to have enough consistency. I mean, it's a well-known disease.
Okay.
But it never appeared in Africa at all. And yet Africans married their sisters in some royal families. But they never cohabited with their sisters. In fact, the Romans and the Greeks never understood, but the Romans and the Greeks never understood the Africans anyway. I think the Romans and the Greeks were highly overrated. But I think the Greeks were partially smart after they had borrowed quite a bit from the Africans. I really don't think the Romans were smart at all. I think they were fine soldiers.
Okay.
Wouldn't find much else.
You say the European cannot afford to be democratic, cannot afford to be Christian. Explain.
In the 15th and the 16th century, when the European came out of the lethargy of the Middle Ages, created the slave trade and the colonial system that was to follow, his method was totally undemocratic and totally unchristian. His rationale was unchristian and undemocratic. He gained control over most of the world. He not only colonized most of the world, he colonized information about the world. He said some principal things about the world that was not true. In other words, he lied. And he said some things about people's history that was not true. In other words, he told a lie. He stole people from a continent into the millions. And otherwise, he violated one of the commandments, that if he was Christian, he would return those people and make amends. And if he did that, he would wreck his economy. That if he really made amends and gave back to people to the extent that he's taken away from them, he would have to live on another economy. He's not willing to do that. And yet, the system of segregation and the system of apartheid was set up with the approval of his church, which is an unchristian thing to do. The Ku Klux Klan in the United States quotes the Christian church and says that they are Christians, and they are anti those who are not of the Christian faith. Most of the white bigots in the world proclaim to be Christians, and other Christians fail to correct them. They can't afford to correct them and maintain the power control over the world that they literally insist on maintaining in the whole world. So the Western or white dominance over the world is undemocratic and unchristian. The way they got it is undemocratic and unchristian. The way they maintain it is undemocratic and unchristian. The way they design the textbooks to aggrandize themselves at the expense of other people is both undemocratic and unprincipled. Unprincipled, unchristian, and undemocratic.
You now have a good number of black people who patronize white national ministers, if you will. How do you feel about that? How do you see the propriety of that, and what role did these white ministers play in the liberation of black people?
They played none. Mm-hmm. I think Jimmy is a good actor that should be in Hollywood. I think he's a millionaire actor. And I question whether he's willing to practice any of the freakism that he preaches.
What do you mean there?
I mean, he speaks of God, God, God. But I mean, go down into the street and live some of it. Go down into just among the white poor, and relieve some of them of their misery. Be a Christian, starting with the white poor. I question whether he will take his Christianity that far. Go among the Appalachian mountain poor whites.
George studied the European mind very closely and very deeply, and he perhaps was able to find out in his observations that the root of all European motivations may in fact be sex and aggression, which is what he concluded. Now, he did not study African American people. He never looked at an African American person. I doubt if he ever met one. So therefore, those assumptions about how human beings function, that is, concluding that the base of all human motivations are sex and aggression, may be true of Europeans, but there is no way to assume that that's true of African Americans. So